Well, it's turning out to be a beautiful day, but you should know that this isn't the way that we planned it. This isn't the way that we wanted it. We wanted to be outside. We ended up inside. And just so you know, there was a tie for the first place in votes for the dunk tank. And unfortunately, with all the Davidson kids voting for me, I tied with Diane Deering. So thankful for Diane. But you know, this isn't the way that we planned it. We wanted to be outside. We didn't want to be inside. But you know what? Whether we're inside or outside, God is good. And God is faithful. Whether it's a 70-degree sunny day, or whether it's the third 100-year flood in the last 25 years, God is good, and He is faithful. Whether this nation is soaring and the economy is booming and the church budget looks amazing, the pews are filled, and the community loves us, or whether we face unprecedented hardship and distress as a nation, whether this church struggles and we can barely meet, or maybe not even meet our budget or fill our pews, maybe the culture doesn't like us at all, God is good, and He is faithful. Well, I'm so grateful for all the expressions of kindness that I've experienced in the past week and weeks, all the support leading up to this day. And I'm amazed at all the volunteers that put in their best efforts to make today work, especially with the change of plan. I heard we had 40 volunteers just yesterday roaming the halls of this church to try to make things work. And I want to encourage you to stay for lunch, please, because we want to see if this is really going to work. I assume there will be directions. Will that be at the very end, Tyson? Directions on what to do, because you need to follow those directions or we're going to have some traffic jams around here. Thank you to everyone. But I hope that you realize, and it's important to me, that you realize that I realize that this day is not about me. We celebrate a God who is good and who is faithful. Well, this church has seen some profoundly lean years. You want to hear about it? It's like the early 1850s. We almost shut this place down just after we started, actually in 1847, not 6, Tyson, but thanks for trying to give us an extra year. I'm the nerd this time. The 1860s through the Civil War were tough times. I'm telling you, the 1880s were amazing. How much we struggled. I have no idea how we built that building down on 3rd Avenue that's now McGann Furniture. And then there were the 1930s. Unbelievable. The church had a split in 1929, and the 30s were just incredibly difficult. The church has seen some profoundly lean years, but the church has also seen some spectacular seasons of great blessing. Dare I call them showers of blessing? Maybe we should call them sun rays of hope or something during many seasons. 1857 and 58. You'll have to hear about it sometime. What a beautiful period of renewal. The 1870s were an amazing time. The 1890s, wonderful years. And I would say the 1920s were among the best years in the history of this church. But whether lean years or times of great blessing and prosperity, we could always celebrate a God who was good and who was faithful. You might remember, some of you, our very first celebration Sunday we had. It was 17 years ago, and it was out on the front lawn over here. Do you remember the weather? It rained, and it rained steadily. And I would say it was maybe our best celebration Sunday ever, because everybody worked together and everybody served one another. Everybody was working so hard to keep everybody dry and move chairs and deal with the loud cracks in the sound system. Thank you to those of you who care so much for our sound system and went through that. Everybody was just serving one another, and we needed to get ready for that, because you know what happened 2 days later? 2 days later was September 11th, 2001. And we had to come together as a church. We celebrated the Lord's faithfulness then, and we celebrate it today. Every year we celebrate the undying, unchanging, rock-solid goodness and faithfulness of our God. But there's something special we realize about today's Celebration Sunday, and I hope that you get it, that this celebration is an exchange of leadership from one generation to another. It's symbolic. That happens over a period of time. But it is not an exchange of leadership from one man to another man. This day makes no sense to me if it's about the exchange of leadership from one man to another. Because first of all, pastors don't run churches. There's one head of the church, and his name is Jesus Christ. And the rest of us, I'm pretty sure, are all part of the body. And pastors have the distinct privilege of pointing the body back to the head. Or another analogy, we're sheep. We are Christ's sheep, and we as pastors point back to follow the Lord, follow our good and great shepherd. Besides, transitions from one man to another are really a small thing. But I think the transition from one generation to another is special. It's incredible. I think it's very powerful. This day makes sense to me and brings me great joy if that's what we're doing here today, calling a new generation to step up and a faithful generation to offer their blessing and support. Well, there are many wonderful transitions described in the Bible from one generation to the next. And one of the most powerful comes from Joshua, chapters 23 and 24. Now, this is going to be an exceptionally short message, and I don't want any of you to get used to those. Because starting next week, we're going to get serious, going by the Sea of Galilee, and I just wanted to spend 6 weeks with Jesus. I thought that's the way I want to start, and I hope that you'll be glad to do that as well. But nearing the end of Joshua's life, he's an older man, and he has this sense of urgency as he ages that he wants his influence to go beyond the days that he has here on earth. Some of you maybe have that with your own children or the generations after. You start to feel that sense of, I'm not going to be here forever, and I want to say some things that I want you to remember. I'm going to say some things that I want to be in your mind after I'm gone. And so he calls all of Israel together. He calls the leaders and he calls the people. And maybe you've heard this passage before. When I was 19 and off at Bible school, I got really cranked up at the thought of the call that Joshua gave to the next generation. And in chapter 24, he challenges the people and says, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods of your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers that your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Now, as powerful and inspiring as those words are in Joshua, you only need to turn one page, at least in my Bible, and you come to the book of Judges, and you read about the end of Joshua's life, and you read just a little bit about the next generation. It says, "When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And listen to this. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down before them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. Now, the most amazing verse in that passage. I'm amazed, of course, that they walked away from the Lord altogether, but the most amazing verse in there is from verse 10 of Judges chapter 2. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Now, if you think about this time, that's a pretty amazing statement. They didn't know the Lord and the work that he had done for Israel. What had just happened before this generation was raised up? They had been in Egypt for 400 years. You don't think they had ever heard about that? They experienced these incredible plagues, and finally the killing of the firstborn, and the Passover meal, and the crossing of the Red Sea, and the entrance into the Sinai desert, the approaching of Mount Sinai itself, and all the thunder and lightning, and God himself speaking to them and giving his law, and the tabernacle, and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and seeing God do all sorts of miraculous things. And then finally they came and crossed the Jordan River and entered into the promised land and defeated Jericho and took the land. Are you telling me the next generation didn't hear any of those stories? They knew nothing. Mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, they never brought up anything from the past. I would argue that they knew the stories, but they weren't their stories. They knew about the things that God had done through his people by faith, them stepping out. But they themselves hadn't stepped up and stepped out. They hadn't lived by faith. They were living off their parents' stories, right? They were living off their parents' faith. They were living off their parents' knowledge of what it was like to walk with the Lord. And those of you who are parents, especially as your kids get older, you realize there's only so far you can take them. You can tell them about the Lord. You can instill within them a certain sense of who he is and what he's done. But you can't make them walk by faith. You can't make them trust him for themselves. You can take them right to that place. And then finally, you have to hand over the reins to your kids and allow them to experience faith in God for themselves. And when you've walked with him, and when you've experienced his power and his strength, you depending upon him and him working in and through you, well, that's a whole other knowledge of God, isn't it? That's the one that Israel didn't have, and they grew up and they didn't know this God. They did not experience his grace. There have been some faithful generations in this church, and I'd like to just point out two of them this morning. And one comes from a period, I call them the generation of renewal. And we have some of them still living in this church yet today. The 1970s were a powerful time in the history of this church. The 1960s were very lean years. Another church split, and very challenging years. And then in the early 1970s, we got a new pastor. It was Pastor Carl Zwart, my childhood pastor. And this generation of leaders that came along at that time, they saw an incredible period of spiritual renewal, spiritual vitality. I would argue, and I've done more history than anybody on this church, I would argue the greatest period of spiritual renewal, sustained spiritual renewal, came in the 1970s. It was amazing. People's lives were being changed. We had lots of Nicky Bauman stories going on in the church during those years. Evangelism and missions, expository Bible preaching, just a wonderful period in the history of the church. And God blessed. And the numbers of the church just grew, and not only in terms of the budget, but in terms of number of people. They kept having to come up with building projects to work on, always thinking of what are we going to do next, setting that sail, because God is blowing. I actually met with Carl Zwart just about 2 years ago now, I think in September. And I went and I wanted to talk to him a little bit in my study of the history of the church. And I asked him about this period. I said, what was going on? And I brought up all these numbers. I mean, the church attendance and budget was doubling about every year or two. Just doubling and doubling and growing and growing. And I shared those numbers with him. And he said, wow. He said, I don't remember those numbers. But I remember lives being changed and people being saved. It was a beautiful time of spiritual renewal. But you know what? They wanted to build. They wanted to build this church. They wanted to build a new church. For 12 years, they talked about building. But you know what the Lord said? I'm going to raise up another generation. I'm going to raise up a new group of leaders. Some, of course, were the same leaders. But we're going to raise up another generation of leaders. We're going to have a new leader. Pastor Dave came in 1989. From 1977, I think I had them already talking about building plans. 1989, Pastor Dave came. And I would call it, maybe this is a little over dramatic, but I call it the generation of conquest after Joshua. Taking the land, going and stepping out. It was a big deal to build this church. We were a small congregation, and we didn't know how this was going to go. But under Pastor Dave's fine leadership and many, many faithful leaders of this church, the 1990s were a beautiful period of faith-filled service by a new team of leaders. And God did amazing things through this time. We've seen amazing things in the 90s and 2000s up to this current day. The amount of ministries in this church, certainly the number of people and the financial blessing of this church, souls being changed and saved. I love when they said testimony, I said, contact Nicky Bauman. I want to hear her share her testimony. I'm so grateful for that. God has blessed another generation that has come up, and they had to do it on their own. They couldn't trust what was said about the 70s. They had to step out in faith and in faithfulness and experience God's strength and His grace and His power. And when you step out in faith and the Lord carries you, you're changed. And you know Him in a way that's not going to leave. Well, the generation of the 70s and the 90s, I have news for you. I see another generation being raised up. I see 20s and 30s. I got to include the 40s since I'm well into my 40s now. And I see people in their 50s that are ready to step up for the first time. And they're saying, we want to serve. We want to lead. We want our chance to see what God can do. We want to trust Him, faithfulness, and see what amazing things He'll do through our generation. So I'm going to ask the generations that have gone before us. I'm going to actually have you stand up in just a second, and I'm going to ask you if you will allow us to step up and to lead. First generation I'd like to have standing is the one that probably has the hardest time standing. Sorry about that. But I'd like to ask those who were adults, not kids like me in the 70s, But those who are adults or in service during the 1970s, would you stand at this time? Wonderful. Wow, I recognize these faces. And I'd like to ask those who served, trusting the Lord in the 1980s, would you stand at this time? You were adults, 1980s. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And then the 1990s, would you stand? If you were an adult in service in the 1990s, wonderful. Praise God. Now I'm going to ask anybody, you may not be from Walnut Hill, but you got me beat. You've been trusting the Lord a lot longer than I have. If you have been serving or trusting the Lord as an adult, not necessarily from this church, but through the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, would you stand as well? God has been so good. He has been so good. Thank you for your service. I'm going to ask, no, please remain standing, please. Please. If you can, Dad, lean on something. I want to ask you for the generations coming up, will you allow us to lead? Will you allow us to step out in faith and make some mistakes along the way? I know you made some mistakes too. But committing ourselves wholly to God's word and His ways to experience the wonders of walking by God's grace. We're not asking you to step aside. Please do not leave us. Don't step aside, but stand beside us. Support us. Encourage us. And increasingly, over the coming years, call us to carry the torch. Running faithfully, Lord willing, as you have done, until you can run no further. And we are called to pass the torch to those who will come after us. We want to know the Lord and see the great things that He will do in our time. Will you allow us to lead? All right, everybody else, would you stand up? Younger ones, you're not off the hook. It's time for you to step forward. We can no longer live off of all these others and their stories. By faith, we must create our own. And I'm going to conclude with the words of Joshua. Choose you this day whom you will serve. Be it not the God of sin and selfishness and self-pursuits. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I'm so grateful in this place. I know that we will not be alone. Let's pray for God's strength. Lord, that is our prayer. Lord, if we're going to step out in faith, it's not about faith. It's about the one that provides grace, that makes faith victorious. And we cry out to you, Lord, to lead. We're stepping forward. We may be the generation that needs to step up and move. But Lord, we're not doing it without our brothers and sisters that have gone before us. And we are most certainly not doing it without you. Come, lead your people. Come, guide our generations as we move forward. We pray this blessing in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you remain standing, please?